As I believe I previously explained in my email containing all of the materials for this chapter, we're actually going to take Module 10 and we're going to divide it into two separate pieces. She covers both Kingdom Protista and Kingdom Fungi in this module, and there is just a lot of information here to absorb. So I decided that it would probably be best if we just divided the chapter into two pieces and had a test over each individual piece of that. The first half of the chapter is on the protistans. And protistans, as you should already be aware, are all eukaryotes, which means that their cells have membrane-bound organelles. And really, these are the eukaryotes that, although they're all in the same domain as the fungi and the plants and the animals, the protists really don't fit into the other three kingdoms very well. Most of them are unicellular. Some of them are going to live in colonies, like we talked about back in Module 9. Some of them are multicellular, although not very many of them. Most of them are unicellular. And we are going to subclassify these protistans by their feeding habits. Now, I actually had you fill out a chart, and there are more charts coming, as you've already seen. We're going to fill out a chart for each major division of the protistans. And just as a kind of a side note, charts are a fantastic way to organize information, especially if you're trying to look at different characteristics and you're trying to compare and contrast different groupings who are all under the same heading. You probably have already seen that I love charts and I love branching diagrams. Branching diagrams help you to see how something further breaks down. So if I were going to use a branching diagram for the protistans, I would put all protistans up here at the top, and then I would further break that down into the animal-like fungi, which are the protozoans, and they are all, because we classify them by feeding habits, the protozoans are all heterotrophic. We can classify some of the protistans as fungi-like, and so that means by feeding habits, most of them, or almost all of them, are going to be decomposers. And then you're also going to have your plant-like protistans, and they're all called algae, and they're going to be autotrophic. So here you can see I'm using a branching diagram to take a bigger group and break it down into smaller ones, whereas we're going to use charts to be able to compare and contrast the different categories within a larger category. So today's topic is protistans. You've already done the vast majority of this work, and so now you should just have your chart in front of you, and we're going to go over it. You can add things in that maybe you missed. You can make some special notes. I'm going to try to give you some memory tips. I'm going to point out a couple of things that perhaps were confusing to you, and then we'll just kind of do an overall summary of the protozoans within Kingdom Protista. So like I already mentioned, your protozoans are animal-like. I think that may be above what you're able to see. I think I wrote it up too high on my board, but protozoans are animal-like, and they're also heterotrophic. So they're going to get their food in ways other than producing it themselves. So there are these animal-like protozoans are classified according to how they move. And so let's go over, we've got four main groups here, so let's go over each one of these groups individually. The first group are the Sarcodines, and the Sarcodines all move by pseudopods, which means that they're going to take their cytoplasm and they're going to shove it out in a projection, and then they're going to move. It's a very slow, laborious process of how these organisms move. You've seen some videos of how they move already. So the pseudopods are used for locomotion, but you'll also have noticed that these pseudopods are also used for phagocytosis. They will take a pseudopod, come around each side of their prey and engulf it and close it, and then digest their prey within a vacuole that they produce once they have surrounded it by phagocytosis. So although we're classifying these pseudopods under their method of locomotion, they're also used for their feeding mechanism as well. Because all of these organisms are eukaryotic, they obviously are all going to have organelles. So they're going to have all the organelles that we have talked about previously when we discussed the cell, but some additional organelles that maybe we haven't talked about at least quite as much. You're going to have food and contractile vacuoles. Your food vacuoles obviously are there to store food. Contractile vacuoles are going to be to pump out water so that the organisms don't explode. We've talked about diffusion and osmosis, and we said if the concentration of solutes, dissolved solutes, is higher in one spot and you've got pure water on the outside of it, you're going to have water that's going to rush into that organism because they're going to be trying to equalize the concentration, and then what's going to happen is you're going to have so much water rush in that the organism is going to explode. Obviously not conducive to life if that happens. So the contractile vacuole is there to maintain the water balance, to pump out all the excess water that may be trying to flow into this creature. So a representative organism of phylum Sarcodina is the amoeba. And some special features that I noted here, they form cysts. If things get unfavorable for them to survive, they will form a cyst. And then they also are going to reproduce asexually, which means that the offspring are going to be identical to the parent. Okay, so that is the Sarcodine. And this is one of those things that a lot of the other group names for them they're more easily remembered because flagellates have flagella and ciliates have cilia. Sporozoans produce sporozoa, or produce spores rather. The Sarcodines is kind of an odd name for these, but the way that I remember this is that Sarcodines starts with a S sound, and pseudopods, even though it starts with the letter P, that P is silent, and that also starts with a S sound. So Sarcodine, pseudopod, and the word cyst also starts with a S sound. And so you can kind of associate all those S sounds together when you're trying to remember some of the characteristics of the group of Sarcodines. Moving on to the flagellates, their method of motion is going to be a flagellum, which is going to be this really long whip-like extension. Some of them are going to have two flagella in place of just one. They also are going to have food and contractile vacuoles. The one organism that you really focused on when you read about these were Trypanosoma. Just like Euglena, they use phagocytosis to get food, and they also are going to reproduce asexually. Now, some biologists are going to put Euglena into this category as well. The last book that I taught biology out of, that particular book said, Euglena is in the flagellates, and others of them, in fact, your book said, no, Euglena is not in the protozoans. They're actually classified with the algae, and there's reasons for classifying this particular creature both ways. The scientists who are trying to classify Euglena with algae say that they classify it there because the Euglena is autotrophic, it has chloroplasts in it, as you've already studied, and they can make their own food. So because they're autotrophic, we're going to put them in with the algae. However, the biologists who say no, Euglena should really go in with the flagellates are looking at some other characteristics. They say, first of all, the algae don't move around in the same way that Euglena does, and so its locomotion makes it look an awful lot more like a protozoan than it does an algae, because it moves around much more like an animal does. The other thing that's true about Euglena, and I don't think your book mentioned this, is that if a Euglena gets caught in an environment that doesn't have very much light in it, a Euglena can actually lose their ability to photosynthesize, and then they spend the rest of their lives completely heterotrophic. And so I think that's probably the reason that I tend to lean toward putting Euglena in with the flagellates. But again, there are people who are much smarter in biology than I am who say, no, the Euglena definitely belongs in with the algae. And so just be aware that the next textbook that you read, it may differ on where they classify this particular organism. Euglena is a fascinating organism. All right, so flagellates and flagellum, obviously those two are going to go together. Ciliates are going to move with cilia. A flagellum is much longer than a cilia is, relatively speaking, And an organism that has cilia around it, as you've seen in the pictures that you've already colored, the cilia go all the way around the creature and they kind of beat back and forth together to help the creature move along. They also have, in the representative organism that we studied, which was Paramecium, they also have food and contractile vacuoles, just like the other creatures did. The difference here is that the Paramecium has used so much energy for its locomotion that they actually have two different nuclei, a macro and a micronucleus, because the macronucleus is going to take care of the metabolism, while the micronucleus is going to take care of the reproduction. So this is the first time we've seen this particular characteristic in any type of a cell. As far as their digestion goes, the cilia are used to sweep the food into an oral pore and then down through an oral groove and then into a gullet where a food vacuole will be formed to take care of the food that has been taken in. So again, the Paramecium is your representative organism. Couple of the special features of the Paramecium, they reproduce by conjugation and asexually. Now, conjugation is where they exchange genetic material through the oral groove. They exchange the information, but at that particular point, there's actually no reproduction because you have two Paramecium. They join together for conjugation, then they separate again. So there's, again, no reproduction has taken place at that point. But after the genetic material has been exchanged, they will then reproduce asexually, just like the first two classes that we talked about. Okay, these guys also will form cysts in unfavorable conditions. So similar to how we talked about that S sound up in the Sarcodines and the pseudopods and the cysts, the ciliates kind of also starts with a S sound, and they form cysts also. And here, even though it's not a S sound, it's a C sound, it's a hard C with conjugation, that C can also go with the ciliates too and remind you of that. Finally, we get to the Sporozoans, and the Sporozoans are classified by the fact that they don't have a method of locomotion. So we talked about, or the example you looked at there were the Plasmodium, and the key points to remember about the Sporozoans are that they form spores to reproduce, and all of them are parasitic. So those are the main characteristics of your 4 classes of protozoans.